So this next session is, I think, a very interesting one because, as we discussed this morning with Minister Sohi and separately in some of the panels, the need to address Aboriginal communities and the challenges they're facing with respect to infrastructure development is truly huge and substantive. And as you know, I think maybe most of you have been able to pick up a copy of this report that we're actually formally releasing today, which addresses exactly that issue. And while it's very good at pinpointing the challenges, the real issue now is what do we do with this report? How do we really move the yardsticks? And I think we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that today with the panel that's up next. They'll be talking a bit about climate change, but a lot of it is about really moving the First Nations agenda ahead.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Hi, everyone. As Mark said, my name is Jeff Frank. I'm with the Castlemaine Group. We've got a head office in Vancouver and one in Toronto. Most of these guys I know. There's only a few of us have been in this space for a while here, so it's nice to be up here with them. I'll introduce the panel first. Way down there is JP Gladue. He's President and CEO of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. Immediately next to him is John Paul. He's Executive Director of the Land Policy Congress of First Nation Chiefs. And closest to me is Dale Booth, President and CEO of Tyree Innovations. So, like I said, we've all been around the space a fair amount, and it's been interesting and frustrating at the same time. But I think it's, especially in the last couple of years, I think we're starting to see, or have the ability to see some movement in a way that we can actually bring First Nation and Aboriginal P3s back into the context of maybe even looking at some implementation. So the first thing I'm going to do is shamelessly plug the fact that we did produce this. Dale and I, we combined together with the Canadian Council of Public-Private Partnerships to produce P3s, Bridging the Infrastructure Gap in Canada's First Nation Communities. It was a long haul to put it together. There's lots of varying information. I think that was one of the bigger problems that we had the whole time, was trying to get consistent information both from the government and from private sources. So we spent an awful lot of time putting it together. It's available for pickup out front, and if you can't get it there, you can go online to www.pppcouncil.ca to pick up an electronic copy. Main findings, I don't know how much everyone's experience with First Nations and infrastructure is here, but not terribly, there weren't a lot of surprises. Deficit on reserve, depending on who you're at, some of the estimates is well over $30 billion. So that's roads, sewers, schools, major buildings, power, to name a few. The biggest one he has housing, sorry. It's growing. I think that's the scariest thing, is it's not decreasing. Spending on it, despite what you hear in the news, is declining on a per capita basis. First Nations are also one of the fastest growing populations in Canada. So we've got a big issue, and it's going to only increase. So looking at new ways of delivering infrastructure on reserve and in traditional territories is going to be a major issue, especially in the next 10 years. In the right, as we've all maintained, and there is a great world for P3s to participate into First Nation infrastructure projects. It can be a useful tool to reduce a deficit in the gap we're seeing in infrastructure, but it's got a lot of work. We have big policy work we have to do with Indian Northern Affairs, Treasury Board, PMO's office. I mean, there's just a lot of different players that have a significant role in bringing P3s to fruition. We know the private sector is interested, but we also know you need certainty. I think that's one of the biggest hindrances from getting involved in infrastructure projects with First Nations is the certainty, whether it's the political certainty, whether it's the financial certainty. These are big issues that have to be addressed. So the report highlights these things. It highlights the hurdles, and it also gives a couple ideas on how we can get through all that. So I'd be interested to get feedback from everybody if you get a chance to read it, and you can supply comments back to the council, because it'd be really great to hear, especially from this crowd, on what your thoughts are. So I think we'll get started here. The first thing we're going to start with is an ask an audience question. I think the first one, we got it up, is which asset class holds the most promise for P3s and First Nation communities? I'll give you a couple seconds to finish it off. Interesting. Water, wastewater. That's an interesting comment. I mean, that's not untrue. Housing would probably be my guess. I don't think if you go back in here, but the housing deficit right now is well over 80,000 units. And if you maximize that or multiply that out by 250,000 a home, you can kind of get some sort of context on how big the housing issue is. And that's meant to grow. They figure housing in First Nations is going to reach about 130,000 units deficit by 2025. So it's a pretty scary number. So we'll get started here. And I'm going to start with Dale Booth. Dale, you have quite a bit of experience trying to get a P3 project on reserve off the ground from your prior days and now. Can you tell us a bit about your experience and dive right into what you think the largest barriers are?
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Well, I think the largest barrier out there really is the manner and the policy around funding that goes into the communities in terms of, let me give you an example. So on that list, you've got schools, water, wastewater, and social housing, okay? So in terms of schools, the department will fund 100% capital and 100% O&M. That's a pretty good candidate from a financial sort of package of P3. You look at water and wastewater, they'll supply 100% capital, but only 66 or 75% O&M. That causes, obviously, issues during the O&M phase if all of it is not taken care of. A lot of people aren't going to take risk in that way. So that may be something that there's going to be challenges around it, but it's going to be something that is going to definitely need some policy change. Social housing. The way that social housing is funded in First Nations communities through CMHC, it's a real mix across the country. So it would be a good candidate for P3. I think if we look at the BC housing experience and some of the things that were learned during that particular project, that I think it would be good. But the way it's funded is a huge barrier for First Nations to be able to look at it in terms of P3, the way they're funded now. So I would say the biggest thing is the way in which, not that there's not funding, but it's the way in which they're funded that really now determines whether or which asset class is the best one to go after. And again, like I said, my idea is that schools would be, but there is definitely going to need to be some policy change. There's definitely going to need to be some policy change in water, wastewater, and social housing if we want to make these things happen. And I know my colleague John Paul is going to probably talk a little bit about some of the things he's run into in his project. So. Awesome.
And that's a good lead in. John Paul, you've had an interesting proposal in the Atlantic in regards to water and wastewater. It's been a 3, 4, 5-year process to date. Can you tell the audience what you're trying to achieve and discuss the challenges you've had in successfully executing a P3?
Well, I think it's a large project of trying to bundle water and wastewater in 33 communities across 4 provinces. And some communities are small, some communities are large, some involve municipal agreements, about 10 of them. And basically it's coming up with creating our own First Nation, Atlantic First Nations Water Authority to create one consistent governance process across the region that would basically undertake procurement and undertake the long-term management of consistent quality services to all the communities and really try to ensure that we meet or exceed the current rules, because right now there are no regulations with the new Safe Drinking Water Act for First Nations. Over the last 2 years, we've been pressing the government to create rules that would help us clearly identify the procurement cost. We kind of know what the procurement cost would be if we use the standards of the Atlantic standards that exist today on procurement, but it really goes back to what are you going to do in the long term, and how do you mitigate big risk is like continuity of governance in communities. Another big issue is land. You know, one of the big aspects of this project was we were going to undertake 23 land transfers in 23 communities. In Canada, the most land transfers that have occurred in 1 year is 4. So if that's kind of like looks like a challenge, it is. And we were looking at trying to do it consistently across the communities, and basically explain it to communities is it's a liability transfer from the leadership in the communities to another body, which ends up being the same communities, but it really tries to concentrate it in a way that makes more sense in the context of a utility versus individual communities trying to do projects of whatever size and magnitude that made sense or didn't make sense. And I think that long-term funding surety is a big issue. And one of the perspectives that I hold is that if you really want to do this stuff, you really have to look 20, 30, 40 years out in terms of exactly what you're going to do and build it that way so that you're able to sustain the quality of service over the whole life cycle of the project. And we've had many discussions with our large municipalities in Atlantic Canada, and we've learned a lot from them in terms of looking at the future, in terms of looking far enough into the future to be able to figure out exactly what you have to do to mitigate the future. And you know, we work with Halifax Water and other regional municipalities to figure out what the bigger time horizon is to do this stuff, and what are the best practices to do this, and how can we have knowledge transfer between those agencies and us to create our own agency. If we ended up, I think one of the things is if we actually did this, we'd be one of the 6th or 7th largest utility in the country, basically. And I said that would be fine with me, because my only goal fundamentally is to provide safe water for communities, basically. That's been a goal from the initial idea that come to this project, but it's trying to convince both government, the private sector, and others to really come up with a mechanism. And we looked at P3 as one of those ways to come up with a mechanism and a process that dealt with the procurement and dealt with the long-term risk and liability exchange in such a way that, one, projects get done on time, on budget, and that you have a really good plan in terms of exactly what you're going to do for the next 30, 40 years. And I look at it from my perspective, and that's a fundamental shift from the way the process works today. And I think with the rigor that's involved with what I've seen with a variety of P3s, I think that kind of rigor for us would be good, but I also think that it would ensure that the whole life cycle of the project is protected, because I think that's what everybody's worried about. It's about actually doing the procurement in a way that makes sense, and then making sure the project actually lasts for the whole life cycle. And you don't have to worry about things going sideways, or, you know, we're in an election cycle every couple of years, but hopefully this different type of structure focused solely on water and wastewater would change that concept about governance and the need to ensure those standards over the whole life cycle of what you were doing.
Yeah, thanks. JP, this will be right up your alley. Another potential challenge may be the building of relationships between large consortiums and First Nations subcontractors. Can you tell us a little bit about the opportunities that exist for partnerships? And are there any best practices in forging those partnerships?
Sure. Can I get that question? Because I think this would help set the context, the one question I had for the audience.
Oh, sure, yep.
So can you cue that up on the Aboriginal GDP? There we go.
Okay, so what is the Indigenous GDP expected to hit this year? Give us your best guess.
Like Jeopardy.
Awesome.
Okay, there's quite an array of answers there. For those that said 30 billion, you're correct. So 30 billion is what our people are expected to contribute to the economy this year. And it probably surprises a lot of people in this audience. And I get it, because mostly what you see is not exactly the pretty stuff. And if we look at the actual GDP, about $12 billion of that is coming from our Indigenous businesses, from coast to coast to coast. Some of our businesses are into infrastructure. Some of our Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations are generating, a quarter billion to $500 million a year in revenue. So the reason I'm saying this is because we need to understand, we need to change the mindset in this country that Indigenous people don't have contributions to make to the economy, or that we may not be great partners to work with. And I want to take one example as far as a best practice to get to Jeff's question. There's a company up in Fort McMurray, Dave and Nicole Boucher, and they started off their company with one truck, one vehicle doing some road construction. They grew that over time. They're doing well over $150 million a year in revenue. 70% of their employment base was First Nation and Métis based, and they came up against a glass ceiling. They were having a hard time competing against some of the companies in this room. And so what they did is that they looked for a partner, and I think partnerships are really going to be that next wave of, in all sorts of avenues in this country, with a company that would subscribe to their vision. And they partnered with Carillion. And the amazing thing about this is that people in this audience are probably, oh yeah, so Carillion's probably the managing partner and owns 51% or more control of the company. And actually quite the opposite is true. The First Nation couple actually owns and manages 51% of that company. They're leading a global company in infrastructure development, a lot of civil roadwork in the Fort McMurray area around the oil sands. So what that tells me, and I hope you also understand, is that the capacity, the complexity, there is an evolution that is happening with the Indigenous business population. And this is only going to go on. There is a great piece by, I don't know if folks know Steve Lindley, he sits on the board of the CCAB, written about 6 months or 8 months ago. Companies that do not form business relationships, partnerships with Indigenous communities or businesses are the ones that are going to fall behind. And that's just going to be a reality we're looking at. So my question earlier this morning to that panel, to Michael, was fishing a little bit, but he gave a great answer because we don't really have that history. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be making bold steps forward when we talk about building these relationships. And I want to pull out a couple of we have a program at CCAB, we're over almost 35 years old, but we have a Progressive Aboriginal Relations program, and two of our gold partners, Bruce Power and Suncor, they're Par Silver, they're actually re-engineering their procurement practices or their policies when it comes to their entire supply chain. So what they're saying is, everything else being equal, Indigenous businesses are going to get extra points on the scorecard. Now, what I just showed you is that Indigenous businesses can compete in the same level as the folks in this room. So that's great news. And the other thing is, if we can't find an Indigenous business that can compete in that sector doing any of these major infrastructure projects, we're going to look to partners, big companies that have progressive Aboriginal relations, because it's important that we start to drive this relationship down the entire supply chain. We talk about this long-term investment in this country, and we talk about, if I can use an analogy of, a unit in the Army, you're only as strong as your weakest soldier. Well, right now, the Indigenous population is probably our weakest soldier in this country. And if we can strengthen that youngest, fastest growing demographic in this country, we're only going to contribute to your workforce. We're only going to contribute to your base of infrastructure development as we move forward. So partnerships, key messages of what I've just said, partnerships are going to be key. And just lastly, one of the big reasons why I love P3, I sit on OPG's board, and one of the projects that we've got under our belt is with Lower Matagami, and 25% of that project is owned by the First Nation. So at the end of the day, we talk about major energy infrastructure in this country. So do you think that that community is going to start protesting their own project? The more that we can integrate Indigenous people into every part of our business chain, right from suppliers right through to equity position holders, the relationship's only going to go that much further and advance Canada's interests.